Welcome everyone to the Strickland Distinguished Scholars Webinar Series, Diverse Histories for a Diverse Nation. I'm your co-host, Martha Norkunas, speaking to you tonight from the Public History program at Middle Tennessee State University. I'll be joined tonight by my co-host, Dr. Nedra Lee, and by Dr. Brad Wright, our question moderator. We're honored to be joined tonight by Dr. Dwight Pitcaithley, former Chief Historian of the National Park Service, Mr. Rolf Diamant, former Superintendent of the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, and Mr. Bill Gwaltney, former National Park Service Assistant Regional Director for the Intermountain Region. Full bios can be found of our speakers on our website, and our webinar will be closed captioned. I have a few other important thank yous to make. A special shout out to Victoria Richardson and the Strickland Committee in the History Department at MTSU, and to Brian Evans, Kara Hooper, and Meredith Kerr. And especially thank you to Matthew Higdon, our tech consultant. Thanks to our co-sponsors, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the Society of Black Archaeologists, and to some of our other friends who've helped to publicize the event, the National Council on Public History, the American Association for State and Local History, and the American Folklore Society. Lastly, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Strickland family for their support of the webinar series. The Strickland Endowment honors the legacy of Roscoe L. Strickland Jr. and Lucy Strickland. Roscoe Strickland was a founding member of the university's history department, and Lucy Strickland was a faculty member at MTSU and the first president of the Murfreesboro League of Women Voters. Their endowment helps the history department in many ways, not least of which is bringing distinguished scholars to campus. I'd especially like to thank Rocky Strickland for his vision and support of our graduate students during the pandemic. We're going to talk for about 50 minutes or so tonight, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Please feel free to post the questions in the Q&A. Brad will be rejoining us for the last segment, and he'll pose those questions that you've uploaded. And I'm going to start off tonight by asking each of our speakers if they talk for a few minutes about their careers in the national park. Dwight, would you start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Martha. Thanks for MTSU for hosting this as well. I began my Park Service career at Carlsbad Caverns, cleaning toilets, 750 feet underground, about as low as one can go, I suppose, unless you're at Death Valley. And as a seasonal, I worked the maintenance crew for two summers, and then was a uniform guide for a summer. I went, then became a full-time student, and in graduate school was very fortunate to land a contract to inventory old buildings along the Buffalo River in Arkansas, a new park. It had just been created in 1972. This was 1974. This was managed out of the Santa Fe Regional Office. I kept in contact with the folks there after we finished the contract, and 2 weeks after I got my doctorate at Texas Tech, they offered me a part-time job. And I took it, and we moved to Santa Fe, and it turned into a less part-time, more full-time, still tenuous, but I stayed in Santa Fe for 3 years essentially as a research historian, and then had the opportunity to move to Boston, where I met Rolf, incidentally, as the regional historian of the North Atlantic region. The Statue of Liberty was managed, a restoration project in the 80s was managed out of there. I spent 10 years in Boston and then moved to Washington in another regional office, my third regional office, the National Capital Region, managing all of the parks in and around Washington, D.C. And then in 1995 was fortunate enough, very fortunate, to be selected as chief historian of the National Park Service. Roger Kennedy was a director at the time, and he asked me to become chief historian, a position I held for 10 years till I retired in 2005. I have to say that being chief historian of the National Park Service is the best job in federal government. There might be some other opinions on this panel, but I don't know how you can top that. And the wonderful thing about working in the National Park Service is that every employee thinks they have the best job in federal government. So then I retired and I moved to Las Cruces, New Mexico, where I teach part-time at New Mexico State and do some research and writing. And I think we'll probably end up talking about that a little later. So Bill, take it away.
Well, sure. Thanks, everybody. And thanks to MTSU for making this possible. Bill Gwaltney here. I have had a long and checkered career with the National Park Service. I started off in my hometown of Washington, D.C. As a seventh generation Washingtonian. You can't get to be much more of an endangered species than that. I also worked at Prince William Forest Park in nearby suburban Virginia. I worked on the National Mall. I got to go to Bent's old fort in Colorado along the old Santa Fe Trail. I worked at Fort Davis, which was stationed with all four of the all-black Buffalo Soldier regiments over the latter half of the 19th century. I got to work at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Washington, several regional offices, the one in Washington, the National Capital Region where I met Dwight, and also in Southwest Region. I was superintendent at the Booker T. Washington National Monument in Virginia, superintendent at Fort Laramie in Wyoming, chief of interpretation and chief naturalist at Rocky Mountain National Park, and then finished up with the Intermountain Region in Denver, Colorado, before my last 5 years overseas with the American Battle Monuments Commission. In my time, I was, courtesy of Dwight, able to connect and become the president for a while of the Association of African American Museums. I was connected with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, a partial sponsor of this program. I was on the national board for the National Association for Interpretation and was a technical assistant for the motion picture Glory. So that's what you can do with a flat hat.
Rolf?
Hello, Martha and company, and thanks to our hosts at MTSU. My background is a little different. I came into the National Park Service wanting to be, or I tried to become a park ranger. I couldn't get a job for love or money as a seasonal, but after going to graduate school at UC Berkeley, I was interested in the history of national parks and actually got an internship at the startup of the first first generation of urban national parks. So I did the planning for the Golden Gate National Recreation Area with colleagues, and then went down and worked for a while in the startup of Santa Monica Mountains outside of Los Angeles. And I ended up actually a little later on for a year as acting superintendent of Lowell, and that's where Martha and I crossed paths. After the work in urban parks, I did spend a good part of 3 or 4 or 5 years working on what I would call the edges of the national park system, the programs that complement all the parks, that are aimed at providing services to communities across the United States. So I did a lot of work on early community-based conservation efforts around rural wild and scenic rivers, and later on worked on the evolution of what became the system of national heritage areas, which has grown to about 50 of them now across the United States, a different kind of large landscape park that includes many, many communities and people living within them. So I always worked on these sort of the edges of the National Park Service. And then I went a little more conventional, and like Bill, became a superintendent. And but I chose to work on parks that really told part of the story of the history of the National Park Service. In particular, the Frederick Law Olmsted home and offices, and later on, Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller, which is a park about conservation in Vermont. All of that led me to have an opportunity to work very closely, particularly in the latter half of my career, with the National Park System Advisory Board and the Second Century Commission for National Parks that really examined the value of parks, their role in contemporary American society, and tried to reposition or position the National Park Service for the 21st century. And based on that, when I retired from the National Park Service, I've been sort of going ever since. And we can talk a little bit about some of the projects I'm working on now, including a book that reimagines or revisits the basic history of national parks.
I know that my co-host Nedra has a few questions to throw in. So Nedra, did you want to pose something about material culture and archaeology?
Sure. So I thought we could start off by maybe talking about the role, like what role can archaeology play in helping public historians interpret diverse histories within the national parks?
It's not meant to be a stumper, is it? And I know that both Bill and Rolf can jump in, but I'm a historian, not an archaeologist, but I've worked with archaeologists in every stop in my career, because the management of these places involves historians, architects, archaeologists, curators, landscape architects, a whole range of anthropologists, of people who get together to manage these places. I give a few almost anecdotal comments, but about the role of archaeology. The National Park Service or the Congress declared Knife River Indian villages up in the upper Middle West as a National Historic Site. It was the place where Lewis and Clark passed through and met Sacagawea and went on west of the Pacific. And that's why it was established. The legislation is very clear on that. It's a fairly large park in terms of acreage. And one of the first things, of course, the National Park Service thinks about doing is putting in a visitor center. Where do you put the roads? Where do you put the trails? Where do you put the parking lots? All that sort of thing. To do that, because this was a fairly large village, the Park Service had to do some archaeology, find out what was where. And I witnessed a presentation by the superintendent at one point, and she said, when we were finished, we weren't sure to where to put anything, because every time we turned to shovel, we found a piece of the history of this place. And what then caught people by surprise is that not only did they find out the extent of the village in 1804, whenever it was Lewis Clark passed through, but several thousand-year depth of archaeology on that site, which was not known previously and was not a part of the legislation, but clearly was there, had to be respected, had to be interpreted. There's some other stories, but maybe Rolf and Bill can chime in as well.
Well, Dwight, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what came to my mind was a project that you were involved in at Independence National Historical Park, where there was a project to, I guess, it was going to reconstruct or do something with the president's house, but the archaeology told a very different story. Maybe you'd want to just...
If I can do it briefly, it's a fascinating story, and I'm mindful of time, so I'll try to make this brief. The first thing that I think our viewers should be aware of, if they're not already, is that parks develop histories of their own. Choices are made on what to interpret, what not to interpret, what to reconstruct, what not to reconstruct. At Independence, for years, the main feature was Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell, which earlier the Liberty Bell was an Independence Hall. Later, it was moved out maybe 100 yards in front of Independence Hall and put in a very nondescript building that I first mistook for a subway stop in the Philadelphia subway system. A third sort of, or another layer in there was Philadelphia, of course, was the home of the first two presidents of the United States. George Washington, John Adams, both managed the country and from Philadelphia. Well, the site of the president's house, when I got there, or when I got to Washington, I guess, or maybe by the late 20th century, the 1990s, it was not marked sitting on top of the site where the president's house was the women's restroom for the park. The Park Service up until that time had really not thought much about the president's house. I think it's a very complex story, but I think part of the thought was there'd been so much urban renewal in Philadelphia. Even in making the park, they cleared out blocks of historic buildings to create the mall where Independence Hall sits at one end. Then they've built the women's restroom. They thought, well, there's nothing there. Nothing remains of it. And there was a very smart historian, archaeological sleuth in Philadelphia, very luckily, who thought maybe not so fast. And he had done some worse research. He had done some positioning from old maps and photographs. He said there might be something there. The short story is that finally the Park Service moved the restroom, started digging, and lo and behold, found footings for the president's house. And it wasn't built like the White House for the president. It was an existing house that was purchased by the government so the two presidents could live there. It had a very iconic bayfront window, and they found the footings for that under the sidewalk, miraculously preserved. There's another interpretive story there that we may have time for later, but George Washington, of course, kept slaves there. And just behind the footings for the president's house was where the Park Service put the new Liberty Bell Pavilion, where moving from what I call the subway stop into this very nice rectangular building with the Liberty Bell and a lot of interpretation. And there was a bit of controversy, ran for a couple of years of, do we acknowledge the slaves who were on this site at the entrance to the Liberty Bell Pavilion? Do we minimize that? Do we not tell that story at all? How do we deal with that? But we're talking about archaeology, and the archaeology is that it uncovered the footings for the house, and it's now all been filled in. But because we now knew because of the archaeology the extent of the house and the outlines of the house, it's marked at ground level with sort of an architectural framework, open air framework above it. So you get a sense of the space of it. And within that framework then is told the story of George Washington, John Adams, and George Washington's slaves.
Oh, and can you actually go ahead and continue with telling us exactly how that controversy over how exactly the park decided to continue with the interpretation of the holding of enslaved people at that site? I mean, since the archaeology helped totally sort of like put a wedge through that to open that up, like, go ahead and tell us how it
was a very exciting moment, and I was delighted to be chief historian when it exploded, because the Park Service at this time wasn't interested in the slave narrative, was interested in sort of an uplifting 1950s, 1940s Cold War era articulation of American greatness. In fact, when we looked at the existing Liberty Bell exhibits, which hadn't gone in yet, they were in the planning stage, one of the themes was that everybody looked on Liberty and the Liberty Bell the same way. Ironically, they were going to use photographs of a Black man with what appeared to be his grandchildren looking at the bell when it went on tour in Atlanta. An Indian chief somewhere in the West, same tour, I think the Liberty Bell toured a couple of times, in full plains headdress looking at it. And then, as I recall, maybe a white family looking at it from the 1950s or so. And the captions were, "We all admire Liberty and the Liberty Bell." And at the same time that the President's House controversy was growing, there was an interest in Gary Nash, who's a historian of Philadelphia, teaches at UCLA, but he got involved in this and figured out that maybe the story of the Liberty Bell was going to be so one-dimensional, it was going to make any sense to anybody in the late 20th century. And he called me up. We'd known each other because of professional gatherings, and I got involved, and with Gary's help and local people and other park staff, rewrote the narrative that goes in the Liberty Bell exhibit now to recognize that liberty has a funny history in this country. And it works for some people and it doesn't work for other people. And maybe Native Americans and Black people look at it a little differently. And maybe different white people look at it differently. So we tried to, what historians do, complicate the story as much as we could and make it more relevant to a broader span of visitors who come to Philadelphia. That's about as concise as I can make it, Rolf.
Well, thanks, Dwight. The other thing that comes to mind, Nedra, is if you're familiar at all with the African American burial ground in Manhattan. That was going to be it is a GSA building, but the footprint was going to obliterate the oldest burial ground for the city's enslaved population and African American population. That's a long and twisted story, but eventually that became part of the unit of the National Park Service, at least part of it, preserving the burial ground. But that was because people did some archaeology and discovered what was actually there, which was quite an extensive find.
And Bill, you worked with Native communities. Do you want to throw your hand in?
Well, sure. I mean, let me first say that what Rolf and Dwight have done is to sort of show the good news and the bad news, and that's very true. Many national parks, I think we sometimes pat ourselves on the back a little too hard by claiming that we are the real things in the real places. And while there's a lot of truth to that, there's also some awkwardness as well. Those artifacts and replicas of those artifacts, if they're authentic and accurate, really do help people get a sense of another time, another place. There are sort of silent witnesses to the past. And there's some degree, I guess, of muscle memory almost that the visitor can gain. But on the downside, I suppose, when you start talking about a musket, for instance, at Harper's Ferry, you are drawn to the technology of the time and you leave behind the theology, the sociology, and the anthropology. So it can actually narrow your focus instead of broadening it. So very much, I think it's very important for people to be very careful as they select original or replica objects in terms of representing history to the past. In terms of American Indian goings on, certainly I've had the privilege of working in a number of parks where that was an important part of the story. And those artifacts usually were collected well in the past. However, they're still very important. And of course, the role of, say, women, American Indian women is represented in different ways over time based on the same artifacts. One of the things that some anthropologists has mentioned that when you think about it, the long list of items sold at trading posts across the West, after you get through the basic tools for living, 80% of it is really mostly art supplies. That's a very, very different way of thinking about life, especially if you're looking at Hollywood movies as an example.
Yeah. That brings up the broader issue of how the National Park Service interprets diverse histories and some of the challenges and some of the successes of the park's work with diverse communities. Since you're on the screen, Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about your work with the diverse communities and maybe Rolf and—
Sure, I'd be happy to try. Gosh, there's so many ways in which that should have been done, sometimes is done, but often is ignored because part of what drives interpreters, I can speak to the interpretive side more so than the historian side, is often it's driven by a level of personal comfort. And so if you come from a community or the local community is uncomfortable with talking about what happened to American Indians or what happened to enslaved persons or what happened to women as a class, people tend to go for that which is safe and comfortable, and that often takes you down a bad path. You often get questions that you're not prepared for because you lulled yourself into a false sense of security, thinking you only had to talk about, again, the technology, the symbolism, the patriotism that the Liberty Bell represents, as Dwight talked about. So there's a lot of things like that that are part of a changing dialogue. And the artifacts remain important, but the interpretation of those artifacts is what needs focus. And sometimes they get it and sometimes they don't. And more often than I guess I'm comfortable with, that's driven by personal comfort as opposed to professional discipline.
Rick, do you want to chime in?
I will. I'll just put in a plug for a study that was done probably about now 7 or 8 years ago called "Imperiled Promise: The State of History in the National Park System." That looked at this very question of how critical it is for interpretation to be constantly infused with current scholarship. And it's sometimes too easy to rest on a conventional narrative that's been handed down from one interpreter to another over the years. And to some extent, it can lose its connection to reality even, but it becomes accepted gospel. And the report was very clear about the importance of constantly renewing the story. I like to think of the interpretation of parks as an accumulation of layers of meaning. And not all parks start out with a complete, a knowledge of what they're about, or, as Dwight and Bill were describing, they don't know necessarily what's even under their feet. And as time goes on and scholarship continues, and in particular working with local communities, because there's oral traditions, it's intangible heritage as well as tangible items. The stories begin to add value and meaning to these parks. And so it's many strata of understanding. And sometimes you end up in places which you didn't think you'd end up. It's not where you started.
If I can add to what Rolf just said, I'm sorry, Dwight.
No, go ahead.
I will tell a quick story that when I was in the late 1980s at the Frederick Douglass home in Washington, we spent a lot of time there talking about Douglass's legacy, his narrative, and how, as Douglass put it, slavery was the national inconsistency of the United States. On a fall day, you could see across the river and you could literally see Arlington Mansion. And over there, they talked about slavery as a school for freedom, almost diametrically opposed perspectives, the same organization, the same time, and within literal visual sight distance of each other.
I was just going to chime in that we tend to think of the National Park Service, and I certainly did when I started, whenever that was, as kind of this monolithic, unchanging federal agency. When in fact, and it's now 100 years old, 105 years old, I guess, 1916. It's a completely different organization today than it was then. Stephen Mather, the first director of the National Park Service, would not recognize this beast of 419, I think, places that the Park Service is managing and charged by Congress to manage well. It's interesting that until 1997, so the Park Service was created in 1916, until 1997, the Park Service did not have a congressional mandate to do research. It was assumed that it would, because people assumed it had an educational mandate, it had a preservation protection mandate, that research would evolve from both of those. But it wasn't until 1997 that Congress actually gave it a research mandate, both on science and in history and archaeology, cultural resource management issues. And Congress sort of at the centennial mark, 2016, did something miraculous. I test people when I go into the parks to see how much this is widely understood, but it's getting to Bill's point that the Congress required the Secretary of the Interior to make sure that every educational program, brochure, whatever the parks were developing was based on the best and current scholarship. And we talk about, or I guess it was Rolf who was talking about these old stories that are passed down from interpreter to interpreter. That was very common. And now if a park does that, it's illegal because of the Centennial Act, making it, and the language is very clear, that every educational program will be based on the best and the most current scholarship. So it's an evolving agency. In probably another 100 years, we wouldn't recognize what it's going to be like. And a part of that, of course, is beginning, well, I'm not sure when you can mark a beginning, but certainly in the second half of the 20th century, sites that are complicated. I was going to say Booker T. Washington. That was one of the early safe sites that came in. But Martin Luther King National Historic Site in Atlanta, Japanese internment camps in California, Indian massacre sites where the Indians got massacred by white guys. There's a whole Little Rock Central High School. The list goes on now that was a challenge to the National Park Service when they were created. Most of those came in the early 90s. Challenged the National Park Service to think differently about the work it did and the way it approached its educational mission.
It still is a challenge. I did a count based on the number of years I spent in the National Park Service. So I started in the 1970s. I think this system during my career added about 125 new areas. I mean, close to 40% or more, 50%. It was tremendous growth. And you got to give a lot of credit to the Obama administration for a burst of national monument designations of very important sites that really changed the system forever. It was changing, as Dwight said, for a long time, but things really accelerated with Reconstruction era National Park, with Pullman, with the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. This movement in telling this sort of contemporary story of America has been rapidly accelerating. And it's, as Dwight pointed out, the first director would not have recognized the system. I'm not even sure a director from the 1960s or 1970s would recognize the system. It has changed so much.
Can you talk to us about how a site becomes part of the national park system? How does a site get designated?
I'll start. Go ahead, Bill. I'm glad to hand it off to you.
Well, no, actually, you're the guy to speak to this, and you will say this, I'm sure, but as Dwight has pointed out many times, it always starts with a sort of constituency group. There's a political aspect to it, but there has to be someone who cares. And I have had the privilege of working at several places like that, including the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, where a small but tremendously dedicated knot of African-American women said, this will one day be a national park site, and by golly, they made it happen. But with that, I'm sure Dwight can even add much more to the information.
Well, it's the perfect lead-in because there were two attempts to make the Frederick Douglass home a National Historic Site. The first was in the 50s, maybe, Bill, and the ladies who supported it went to their congressman and said, we think Frederick Douglass home is worthy of this. And he said, okay, I'll push it by the National Park Service. And the National Park Service, 1950s, right? Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Country was still very segregated. We still had that mindset. And the Park Service said, well, we don't think Frederick Douglass is significant enough in American history to warrant inclusion in the National Park Service, in the system. Ladies took that, then I'm not sure, 30, 40 years later, they said, the culture had changed, our sense of history had changed. They went back to the National Park Service through their congressman. And interestingly enough, the Park Service said, we're not sure about this. We think not. And the congressman said, that's not the answer I want. And this is all in the records of my office that I ended up being in, and it's a fascinating reading. And the Park Service said, well, under reconsideration, we think he's significant enough to be employed. Now, of course, David Blight's written a Pulitzer Prize winning book on Frederick Douglass, and so goes. But Bill's absolutely correct. It's a constituency group that grows enough support through their congressional delegation. To the normal way it works is that the congressional delegation then introduces a study bill. The National Park Service is given a year, 2, 3, depending on the park, to study the site and run it through the filter of a pretty rigorous set of standards that are published and approved by Congress. Is it nationally significant? Does it have integrity? Is the physical remains still there? Is it representative of a particular type? Is the person, if it's a person site, significant? So forth. The Park Service comes back with the report, and then Congress either vote. Park Service comes back with a recommendation. Yes, it meets the standards. No, it doesn't meet the standards. And then Congress makes a decision. Either makes it a national historic site or a national park or whatever. That's sort of the standard way. We could spend a little time talking about the Antiquities Act, which was created in 1906 to allow presidents to create national monuments by the stroke of a pen. And maybe the first one was Devil's Tower that I mentioned earlier in Wyoming, created by Teddy Roosevelt, right? Who loved this. He loved national forests, he loved national monuments, signed a lot of them. Fast forward into more recent times, there was a number of parks in Alaska that were on the docket to be created as national parks and preserves. Congress dithered and dithered and dithered. And finally, Jimmy Carter said, I've had enough of this. I'm going to make them all national monuments. So through the Antiquities Act, he doubled the size in terms of acreage of the National Park Service from roughly 40 million to 80 million. And then Congress said, oh, okay, and a few years later made them all officially national parks and national preserves. But it takes that people who believe in the place and think it warrants moving from national register status to national landmark status to national park or monument status. There's a stone in there.
As Dwight describes, it's not so simple. It's both from the top down and the bottom up. That, if you really look at the story of the National Park Service, it's not a progressive narrative where there's one act of conservation wisdom follows another. I mean, going back to, I suppose, you can go back to Crater Lake in the 19 teens. I think there were 14 different bills introduced before one got through Congress. This has always been a push-pull. Both a desire to move the agenda, but also to pull back. One could argue that, then once in a while comes a president, and I would use the example of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, who just so completely transforms the map. When I talked about getting started in urban parks, if you really went back and what was the genesis of the whole idea that there would be these enormous federal recreation areas on the edge of cities? It was a decision by the New Deal that they were going to not only incorporate the military sites, but they were also going to look at the social needs of the country. And they were going to use the National Park System as a social instrument, as an instrument to whether it was going to be supervising CCC camps or doing these nationwide recreation studies, which eventually became studies of national seashore possibilities and national lake shores, and finally these national recreation areas. But you have this, you need both ingredients. You need a grassroots push, but every once in a while you need people like Dwight and Bill who are going to champion the cause from the inside, and occasionally even higher up. when you get a good director, it means a lot.
A different way of sort of thinking about this is the growth of the national park system. And Rolf brought up FDR, so let's stick with him for a minute. In Congress in the 1990s created a number of national battlefield parks, 5 basically, from the Civil War. There are a lot of Civil War veterans in politics, and they said we need to preserve this park and that park. And now we go to Gettysburg, for example, which was one of those 5 parks. And it's a national historic battlefield managed by the National Park Service. But Gettysburg didn't enter the national park system until the early 1930s. Those 5 parks and a couple of others were managed by the War Department from the 1990s until the 1930s. And in the early 1930s, the deputy director of the National Park Service, a man who was destined to become the second director, took a touring ride with FDR out to the Shenandoah CCC camps and convinced him that both national monuments that were managed by the Forest Service, by the Department of Agriculture, by a number of other entities, and the battlefield parks that were managed by the War Department really should be managed by the National Park Service. And through a couple of executive orders, FDR again expanded the National Park Service with the bringing in these national monuments and the national battlefields. And if you're familiar with Washington, D.C., which got, how many, Bill? 100, 200 little pocket parks, little triangles and squares with Civil War men and horses on them. He gave all those to the National Park Service to manage, which it still does. So FDR really expanded the scope physically. And I think because of some of the stories in the national monuments and certainly the battlefield parks changed the stories that should be told. Although, and I hope we're going to get to this, it took the Park Service a while to catch up with current scholarship in its interpretation of battlefield parks.
So that was actually going to, sorry, that was going to be my question, was did the inclusion of 5 Civil War battlefield parks come with an automatic discussion about slavery?
Oh, it did. Yes, it did. And the Park Service decision was, we're not going to talk about it.
Okay.
Right, this is 1932, 1933. Again, picture the United States in 1932 and 1933. And the Park Service developed an unwritten policy that we're not going to talk about causes of the Civil War, because if we talk about causes, we're going to end up talking about slavery. And we don't want to go there. And that lasted for 60 years. Bill, you were going to.
Well, sure. And Dwight, you talked about Shenandoah National Park, and rightfully so. Rolf knows this as well, that a lot of Americans miss the point that while that's a wonderful national park, it, like every other branch of the federal government, the Park Service struggled with segregation. And there was a time when there were segregated facilities at Shenandoah National Park. And people are shocked now when they see the photographic evidence of it. So this is not an organization apart from the rest of the government or apart from the rest of the American society. And we still struggle with the legacy of segregation, racism, and slavery.
I would add, we struggle with the legacy of that a lot of national park areas were public lands that had been forcibly seized from Native Americans. And that's a long and difficult story, but that tragedy lives with us today, and that's something we carry with us and need to be able to address going forward. This idea of American wilderness has been really a kind of a grand myth. I think it's Leslie Silko, who's an author from the Laguna tribe, who, when asked to define wilderness, described wilderness as places where people have forgotten the stories. So this is really brought into question, a lot of the early assumptions about the rhetoric and beautiful poetry of John Muir about these untouched, untrammeled wildernesses were in fact places where people had lived for millennia.
Yeah, and I think the legacies of both the national parks relationship to Native peoples and the national parks relationship to slavery and Reconstruction and how it's interpreting those topics is huge. And Dwight, you just started to touch on that. And I know, Rolf, a lot of your work addresses that. Can you, I don't want the webinar to go without talking about how the national park began to interpret slavery as a major cause of the Civil War and what the resistance to that was. And then to also look at what you at one point called the third rail, which is Reconstruction, Ralph. So I think it's really important for us to talk about that change and how and why the national park started to interpret slavery as a major cause and what the resistance was to it and what's happened since.
And we have how long? Yeah, this is a great story. It happened on my watch while I was chief historian, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world. It was the most exciting period in my 30 years with the government. As I said earlier, the Park Service didn't want to talk about slavery as a cause, didn't want to talk about causes at all. And in the first exhibit was a very quiet exhibit at Fort Sumter, not inappropriately, during the early 1990s. So 60 years after these parks came into the system, the superintendent there put a small exhibit talking about slavery as the cause of the war. Fast forward about 5 years, in 1998, there were a number of employees and historians and superintendents who thought, think of the research that had been done on the causes of the war in the late 90s. These people, men and women, thought now's the time we need to start thinking about this. And a meeting was organized in Nashville, organized by the superintendent of Stones River, just outside Murfreesboro, Marianne Peckham, and John Hennessy, who was, I think at that point, the assistant superintendent of Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, who's still in harness, by the way. I spoke to him the other day, and he may be among our watchers. If you're there, John, I'll give you a shout out. John and Marianne organized this large meeting, not just of Park Service people, but of the State Historic Preservation Officer for Tennessee and some other politically connected people to discuss not a broad range, but 4 major topics confronting battlefield parks. Urban encroachment being one, interpretation being another. I'm not remembering the other 2. But at that meeting, August of 1998, the superintendents decided very specifically in the report that came out of it to start talking about the causes of the Civil War and the role slavery played in Southern secession. The backlash was almost immediate. It took a little while for the word of this meeting to get out. It wasn't a secret meeting at all, but word got out. And my office received around 2,200 cards and letters over the next year, I would say, protesting. The Sons of Confederate Veterans had an organized mail-in. There were a couple of organizations that had mail-in responses accusing the Park Service of being politically correct, not knowing its history. Some were personal attacks on me, which I really enjoyed, which I could keep in my files. We expected a backlash. We didn't expect it to be that vehement, or at least I didn't expect it to be that strong. And so we developed a response to some of cards, and it was a standard response. Some people wrote long letters saying, that's, as you know, slavery really didn't get involved in the war until the Emancipation Proclamation in the fall of '62. And so it came to me to respond to these letters, and we responded to everyone that had a return address. Those letter writers, whatever their meaning was, they paid my salary. And I and other people in my office felt obligated to explain to them what the National Park Service was doing and why. And there was a lot of misunderstanding. We weren't going to talk about battles anymore. We're only going to talk about socially correct things like slavery and Black people and that sort of thing. And but but the superintendents had decided this, and one by one, individually, the Civil War battlefield parks amended their interpretive programs, some in small ways, some in huge ways, like Gettysburg's new visitor center, based on, to inform the public, the centrality really of slavery to the Southern mindset at the time and the threat the South envisioned posed by a Republican president in the form of Abraham Lincoln. He was believed at that point to be an abolitionist. The South thought the North was filled with abolitionists, some of them of the John Brown stripe, and if they didn't secede, Lincoln was going to take their slaves from them. It was pretty clear, and it was up to me. Since I've been out of the Park Service 15 years, I wondered about this. So just recently, John Hennessy and I had some exchanges, and I asked him, is this still gaining momentum? Is it still there? And he confirmed that it was, that parks are still on board in exhibits. And I think, Rolf, you mentioned earlier, you'd been at Fort Sumter and heard a ranger, an interpreter talk about this in very specific terms. So it was a sea change in the National Park Service. And for my purposes, the wonderful part about it is that it literally came from the ground up. This wasn't something imposed by the director or the chief historian or even regional directors. It was superintendents and historians in those parks deciding now is the time. And a couple of years later, then we could see the sesquicentennial of the Civil War coming up, beginning in 2011. And John Hennessy, again, bless you, John, developed a couple more programs on how do we prepare our parks for the sesquicentennial based on this new research. And so in spite of all, maybe because of all the hate mail we got, it was a very exciting time for me. I think the Park Service still has all of those 2,000 letters, or maybe they're now in the National Archives. I've written about this in a couple of places, but it was a really exciting time when you saw a virtual explosion in the interpretation of history in a number of national parks.
And Dwight, I know other people have comments, but before you leave, can you just mention how that led to your work on secession documents?
Yeah, be careful what you wish for, I guess. I'd read, because I'd worked on the Gettysburg Commission with Eric Foner and a number of the other leading Civil War historians in the country. I knew that slavery was the cause of it. I didn't know exactly how. And so when I retired in 2005, I thought, for my own satisfaction, I'm going to dig down in the original primary source documents as deep as I can go, just to satisfy myself that exactly how slavery or threats to slavery convinced the South to secede. And I found that there's an enormous amount of primary source material out there from Congress, from state legislatures, from the 11 state secession conventions, from a special convention called in Washington, the Washington Peace Convention, about 8,000 pages, 8,000 published pages of arguments, proposals, solutions. And a lot of that had to do with the solutions. How do we solve this problem? The Deep South states weren't interested in solving it. The Upper South and the North was interested in solving it. And so it turns out that there are 68 separate proposals to solve the problem, all in the form of constitutional amendments. Somebody who has studied the Constitution said this represented a virtual flood of proposals to amend the Constitution. 90% of them had to deal with strengthening slavery in the Constitution, in the federal Constitution. And so my book that Kansas published a couple of years ago, The U.S. Constitution and Secession, is a compilation of these 68 constitutional amendments, as well as other formal documents that provide a window into Southern thinking and really national thinking on the eve of the Civil War.
And Bill, you've done work in interpreting the Civil War in the parks too.
Well, I certainly have, and not just managing it, but doing it in uniform with a musket myself. And I can tell you that certainly what Dwight and Rolf have been saying is very much the case. I got to experience up close sometimes the enthusiasm that a new challenge brings, but sometimes the reticence that a lack of comfort brings. And I'll tell a quick story, which is sort of Civil War connected. When I was at the Booker T. Washington National Monument, it didn't take me long to notice that everything we were doing was divorced from slavery. There was candle making, soap making, basket making, blacksmithing, and they were all attempts to occupy the visitor's time so they didn't have time to ask about the meaning of slavery at that place. And I challenged the interpretive staff to come up with something that was better and more focused, and they just couldn't do it, most of them being from the local area. So I had what they call in the government a small lot sale. We legitimately and legally sold off the soap making, candle making, basket making supplies, and whatever was not sold in the open market, I literally had a committee survey it off, and I had a bonfire and I burned all of the extras, so there was no way to go back to the old-fashioned way of doing business. So sometimes it takes a real radical approach to get people to talk about new stories.
Martha, I'd like to actually follow up that question too. And Bill, can you maybe talk to us about just some of the ways that historians can possibly interpret the Buffalo Soldiers and the role that they played in the Indian Wars?
Well, sure, and I'll be happy to do that. I don't want to go down too much of a side road, but one of the things I guess I would say is that the more you study it, the less iconic it becomes, and it becomes more and more the story of working people. Not only are they working people, but I would suggest that one of the major legacies of Black troops in the regular army post-Civil War is they were America's very first permanent federal employees. That's the kind of meaning you have to reach for. It's not just about guns and flags and bugles. There's a much deeper meaning and you have to look for it. But the problem is all of that other stuff, all of that Hollywood-ish stuff is so attractive to people, they often drive right past it.
And there's another connection with the Buffalo Soldiers. And this goes to my new book on Olmsted and Yosemite. The idea for national parks would not have been possible in a slave republic. That slavery was an impediment to any kind of active government that would, and any movement towards national progress. And certainly public lands would never have been, public lands were there to be sold so that people wouldn't have to tax their property, including slaves. The creation of the national parks I would argue, is a product of the social and political change, revolution, if you will, that occurred through the Civil War. It was forged by the Civil War. And the Buffalo Soldiers are a direct result of the decision in 1863 that African Americans were going to enlist in the United States Army and fight for the Republic. And in fact, by the end of the war, 200,000 Black troops were in the ranks of the Army and Navy. And it was a decisive advantage for the Union to win the war and be able to, as imperfect and as painful as it was, to begin to shape a different kind of country. And it took a long time, and Reconstruction was, one of the great initial failures of the follow-up to the Civil War. But a course was charted that would enable the creation of these public lands. And if it wasn't for these Black troops that Bill's talking about, and it's not the Buffalo Soldiers, but it's their direct antecedents. The soldiers who were first enlisted to fight for the Union, that war would have been lost, most likely. And so when we're talking about who is responsible for, a government that would include the idea of parks that would be accessible to all people, a system of national parks, it is not just, in fact, it's not a handful of mythical pioneers and explorers who suddenly came up with the idea of national parks. It was forged out of a lot of sacrifice during the Civil War that created the circumstances in which our current national park system began very slowly to take shape. Unfortunately, also at the expense of Native tribes and indigenous people.
Rolf, does your book have a title?
Yes, it's Olmsted and Yosemite, Civil War, Abolition, and the National Park Idea. And it's coming out in February of 22.
Well, let's take a few questions from our audience. I'll invite Brad to come back in and spend a few minutes with some of the audience questions.
Yes, such a rich discussion that I'm personally learning so much from. Let's see here. We have a few questions. Thanks everyone for submitting your thoughts and questions here. Let's start with, how does the National Park Service acquire land owned by either private citizens or native owners, native tribes? Is there a federal eminent domain law? How does the NPS acquire land?
That's another complicated one. With regard to the early parks and Native Americans, they simply took it as eminent domain. In private lands, it's generally a sale or a donation. There are occasions, and I'm not conversant with them right now to give you examples of eminent domain being used. Maybe Bill and Rolf can come up with that. But for the most part, if it's a private piece of property, it's either purchased by the National Park Service or it's donated to the federal government after legislation has been created to allow such a transfer of ownership.
And Dwight, not always the case. But go ahead, Bill.
No, go ahead, Rolf.
I was just going to say, it wasn't until the 1960s that the federal government was able to, Congress gave it the authority to use appropriated funds to buy lands. I think Cape Cod was the first example. But, before that, the land had to be, usually was donated by a state government. And in fact, it sort of ties into the story of, Bill was talking about the early segregation of facilities in certain southern parks. Well, those, there were parks like Great Smokies, I believe, Shenandoah. There may have been others where the states acquired the lands and then transferred them to the National Park Service, but with an understanding, and Dwight, you can help out here maybe, that they would follow, the National Park Service would follow the practices, segregation practices of the state parks, those national parks were associated with.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, real quickly, I was going to say that at Rocky Mountain National Park, for instance, even though 85% of the park is now designated wilderness, there are still private inholdings. While we have offered to buy land, when families say no, we have no way to take that land.
Yeah. In fact, there are quite a few parks with inholdings. I experienced that a lot at Minuteman National Historic Park in Concord and Lexington. I was going to just follow up briefly about state transfer of parks and honoring local customs. When the National Park Service first moved into the Civil War business in Virginia, this is again in the 30s, the Park Service was so sensitive to Southern perspectives and perceptions that the Park Service cut a deal with the state historian that no piece of interpretive literature would be accessible to the public until the state had approved it. The other player there was Douglas Southpaul Freeman, who was one of the leaders of the lost cause idea that it wasn't about slavery, editor of a paper in Richmond, I think. And he had to approve that as well. I do not know how long that tradition lasted. It wasn't in place when I became chief historian in 1995, but that's how the Park Service was sensitive to local customs and the way of thinking about the past.
I think Brad has a few other questions. Brad, do you want to go pose another one?
Yes, I think one important one that's been posed here is how has the interpretation of Latinos and the history of Latinos in the U.S. Changed at sites such as the Alamo, but maybe more generally about interpretation of Latino history?
Well, I can get a piece of that. The Alamo is not one of the national park sites. It is a privately owned location. But I think that you not only find sites now that focus on the history of Cesar Chavez, but you find lots of places. I was proud to be able to be, as a volunteer actually, at Fort Union, New Mexico, to create, believe this or not, a group of Latino Civil War interpreters to portray the 2nd New Mexico Volunteer Infantry. So there are plenty of places that are now actively engaging better research and good history to tell Latino stories.
One of the we talked about the growth of the National Park Service and new places in. The Cesar Chavez site in California was fairly recently brought into the park system by Congress, and a wonderful site to talk about multidimensional aspects of Latinx history in this country. And there aren't that many, unfortunately. There should be more. And their Park Service during the sesquicentennial actually produced a book called, I think it's called Latin Americans or Hispanics in the Civil War, I think. They did another one, Native Americans in the Civil War, but it talked about those players, mostly individuals, not units necessarily, except in New Mexico, that had a role in the Civil War. So not enough sites, and the Park Service is sort of hamstrung may not be the right word. It needs to be more creative, like Bill was creative at Fort Union in making the most of what it has. But in terms of Hispanic sites, there simply aren't that many, and there need to be, given the percentage of Hispanics in the country, many more.
I think there's one more good question here if nobody else has further commentary on that issue, or Bill does, it seems.
I do, and that is to follow up on Dwight's point. You know, we heard about how national park sites come into the system. As there are more Latinos represented in our government, in Congress, in the Senate, I think, and more people are actively talking about this history, I think we will see more, because it's a grassroots kind of a movement, and that's how it's going to happen. And I think it's going to happen.
A good question, maybe to and this could get kind of lengthy in terms of the responses, but I think this is a good time to pose it probably. What do you hope, panelists, what do you hope for in the future for national park policies and actions that might bring us closer to reconciliation of our national myths and stories with reality? Future NPS policies, actions to bring us closer to reconciling myth and reality.
I'll kick off, and I'll do this fairly briefly. Is the National Park Service has always been, from its beginning, an educational institution, but it's not always been perceived that way by the public or even by the administration. And you can track this through the chief of interpretation or the associate director for interpretation through the history of the National Park Service. Sometimes it's an elevated position, sometimes it's a minimized position. Sometimes there are strong people in those roles, Sometimes there are weak people in the role. But to get to the question, the Park Service needs to embrace this even more than it already has. It is an educational institution. Roger Kennedy, who we all worked for, director of the Park Service, was fond of saying, we don't preserve these places to preserve them. We preserve them because they have stories to tell, and we have things to learn from those stories. So right now there's an associate, if it hasn't changed, an associate director for education, which is about as high in the organization as that position can get. It needs to embrace it and be bold in going after those myths, which are tough in some instances, as we've all talked about, because there are local players who don't want to be moved. They like that old story. It's very comforting. It's not edgy. It doesn't challenge perceived notions or beliefs in the history of that particular area. But the Park Service has to embrace that if it's going to be the educational institution Roger Kennedy and others have envisioned it can be and should be.
I would add to what Dwight just said in that people need to get tough. And what I mean by that is that when I arrived at the Booker T. Washington National Monument, there was a binder project that was in tandem with the people over at Appomattox Courthouse. And I said, why isn't this done? And they said, well, we wanted you to look at it. Well, I looked at it, and there was no discussion of the fact that the very county Appomattox was in shut its schools down for 5, 6, 7 years rather than integrate. And there was no discussion of the threat of racial violence. And I said, why is that not in here? Well, we talked to some teachers and they weren't comfortable with it. Well, you know what? I'm not comfortable with it either. So either it goes in there or I'm not giving any money to finish the project. And in the end, the project was not done. Now, I had people at the regional office, Dwight at the national office, who backed my moves. It was probably a little out of the norm for a first-time superintendent, but that's the kind of leadership that has to happen. You can't just make the same mistake over and over and expect things to get better.
And I might just add one thing is that the organization really requires a cadre of professionals. And in cultural resources, there has been I think it's fair to say, a pretty disturbing attrition at the Washington level, certainly at the regional level and in the parks. And unless you have those professionals, cultural resource professionals in place, and support them like the Park Service supports natural resources, and there's never been the equivalent of the Natural Resources Initiative, which put a lot of money into professionalization of the sciences. I know there's proposals for that on the cultural side, but it's really needed. And lastly, I would urge people to go online, because the document is online, and look at the Imperiled Promise report, which is a very thoughtful effort by a team of historians to really look critically at what the future of the national park system requires in terms of history and cultural resources. And they have some very specific recommendations.
Yeah. Before we leave the subject, and we're talking about creativity, and Bill mentioned his, Rolf, would you tell shortly the story of your Civil War tour in Woodstock, Vermont, of all places, a place where normally we don't think about the Civil War, but it was an impressive effort on your part.
Well, really simply, it was, when we talk about this layers of meaning, the park, which is, was set up to talk about the history of conservation, was joining right next to it was an old cemetery. It turned out to have 12 graves of veterans of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. As Bill talked about, the Glory Regiment. And in fact, it was Nedra, it really through kind of archaeology, if you will, because we had the park went back to got a hold of all the old pension records of these veterans, Black veterans. And they're filled with affidavits. That's how you got a pension. Your comrades in arms told the story of your service and your life. And all of a sudden, there was a level of understanding of the Black community that was free Black community of that town that had been basically obscured by history and time. But that's what I mean about accumulated layers of meaning. And in fact, it's come full circle, because now we can talk about how those Black soldiers indirectly had a hand in creating the circumstances for a national park system. Certainly the history of conservation.
Well, I think I'm sadly just about out of time, and I know there's a number of other really interesting questions. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that we're going to send the questions to our panelists and see if they want to have a chat about that in some written format. And if I could get our colleagues at the university to post them on our website, because I know some of the questions that you've posed are really important ones, and we would like to acknowledge them and to address them. So we'll see if we can continue the discussion through our site on the History Department Strickland Scholar site. And I just want to thank our scholars so much tonight, Dr. Dwight Pitcaithley, Mr. Rolf Diamant, Mr. Bill Gwaltney, to my co-host, Dr. Nedra Lee, to the question moderator, Dr. Brad Wright. I want to thank again the Strickland family for sponsoring the series. And we will also be posting a recording of the webinar, as we will be posting a recording of the first one to the university's YouTube channel. And I just want to thank all of you out there for joining us tonight. This is Martha Norkunas speaking to you from the Public History Program at Middle Tennessee State University for Diverse Histories for a Diverse Nation. Good night, or good afternoon, or good morning to you from wherever you're joining us from around the world.